Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our monthly Zoom immigration meeting on this beautiful, sunny April 18th. As you know, my name is Mike Sherman, and I'm with the law firm of Sherman Immigration, PLLC, and we handle various U.S. immigration and visa matters for clients in just about every state of the union. Immigration lawyers are unusual. We're really the only kind of lawyer that I'm aware of that can handle cases in all 50 states. Most lawyers, as you know, are licensed by one or more states, and they can only practice in those states. But immigration lawyers we're actually very fortunate. Over time, I've had clients from Alaska to Hawaii to a place like Eureka, Montana, and then, of course, Michigan and other places too. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you find the presentation helpful. Before we get started, I'd like to say some thank yous. First to Carolyn Taylor for all of her research assistance and technical assistance, and then also to Jeff Bumbales and my son, Eric Sherman, for their technical assistance as well. So thank you all very much for helping to make this presentation possible today. So let's get started. As you know, the title of today's presentation is Visa Options for Canadian Citizens. And in trying to come up with that title, I actually had a couple other titles that I started out with and then discarded, but let me give them to you also, just to give you kind of a flavor of today's presentation. So the first title I came up with is, can I really fulfill the J1 2-year residency requirement by sleeping in Canada? The second title I came up with actually was a little more colorful. It's can they really arrest my computer at the border? Well, if you want the answers to those questions, you are at the right place at the right time, and we'll get to that in just a little while. And I look forward to giving you the answers to those very intriguing questions. Let me start out with a story, actually, before we get to the slides and the information. Many, many years ago, when I was a rookie lawyer, and I'm talking about like 30 years ago now, which I still can't believe, my job in the law firm that day was to man the phones and take calls from people who would call in with various visa questions, potential clients, other people who were just looking for information and everything else under the sun. And I got a call from a U.S. citizen, actually a local person here, who told me that as he was talking to me, his girlfriend in Windsor was loading up a U-Haul truck with all of her worldly belongings, and he just wanted to confirm that it would be okay if she just crossed the border later in the day with everything and moved here to the U.S. Now, as a young lawyer, I can say I didn't know that much about immigration law at the time, but I did know that no, that would not be okay, and that a U.S. visa of some type would be required, whether it's a marriage green card or if she instead wanted to get a student visa. I cannot begin to tell you how disappointed this gentleman was when I gave him the news, and he did not take it well. But hopefully, he went on and they got an appropriate visa. I never heard back from them, so I'm hoping that they did the right thing. But that just brings up a point. I mean, we're in such close proximity to Canada. I mean, our office here in Royal Oak, Michigan is, maybe 10 minutes from the border. And so Canadian visa issues or U.S. issues for Canadian citizens come up all the time. So let's talk about some U.S. visa options for Canadians. First, the TN visa, which is known as the Trade NAFTA visa. This visa has been around for decades, and it was originally part of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is an agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Under the prior administration, the treaty was actually renegotiated and renamed to the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Now, of course, your question would be, well, okay, with this new treaty name, this totally new treaty, actually, what changed with the TN visa? The good news is nothing. I mean, not even the name changed. So that's really good to know. Now, in terms of the TN, it's a very easy visa to get. Basically, you would just apply at the border with a letter from a U.S. employer or even a contract from a U.S. employer. But there are many restrictions that are really important. First of all, it's only good for Canadian citizens and Mexican citizens. And that's really a key because if you're a Canadian permanent resident or what they call landed immigrant, it's the equivalent to having a U.S. green card, which is one step below U.S. citizenship. The TN is simply not available. And the same with folks in Mexico, same thing. If you're not a Mexican citizen, the TN would not apply to you. The other limitation that's important to know is that it's only available for certain occupations, and those are occupations that are listed in the appendix of the treaty. Now, the good news is that there are several occupations that are listed, such as certain information technology fields, registered nurses, engineers, pharmacists, and even physicians. But again, with the limitations, it's important to note the following. For instance, registered nurses are definitely part of the agreement and they can get a TN visa, but LPNs or licensed practical nurses cannot. The other important thing to note for hospitals and health centers is that while the TN visa is available for physicians, there's an important limitation on that, and that's what's near the bottom of the slide. Specifically, physicians can obtain a TN visa if they're sponsored for a U.S. job by a U.S. employer, but only if they're coming to the U.S. to perform research or to teach. Now, with that being said, there is some incidental patient care that is allowed, but only as part or as incident or incidental to the research or teaching job. So, of course, the question that comes up, and that comes up here all the time in our office, well, what does incidental patient care mean? What is the definition? Now, you would think that either the treaty would define it or that the U.S. Immigration Service regulations would define it. But believe it or not, there is absolutely no definition. So we don't know whether incidental patient care is 10%, 5%, 60%, 45%. It's really anybody's best guess. On the other hand, the word incidental really does mean incidental and not a central part of the activities, the work that the person is doing in the U.S. So it is an open, it's been open for decades and it remains open in terms of what does it mean and what percentage qualifies. Ultimately, it's really up to the immigration officers or the U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers at the border to determine whether something is incidental or whether something is maybe just a little too much and really doesn't qualify. So there's a great deal of discretion at the border, as you can imagine. So in that instance, if you're trying to get such a TN for a physician researcher, physician teacher, professor, it's definitely important to highlight how incidental the patient care is to make sure that it does appear incidental and that it's not the central purpose of the person coming here. Now, the nice thing about the TN visa is it's actually unlimited. It's issued in increments of 3 years at a time, but there's no limit to the number of TN renewals a person can get. For instance, I've had many people, RNs and others, who have held TN visa status for 20 years or more. And it's every 3 years, they go to the border, they apply for renewal, usually goes very smoothly, and then they're good for yet another 3 years. Lastly, the spouse and unmarried children under 21 can get what's known as a TD visa. Now, the TD allows them to live in the U.S., also allows them to study, but not to work. So if they want to work, for instance, a spouse would like to work in the U.S., that spouse would need to get his or her own U.S. visa if the job that they want to hold in the U.S. Qualifies for such a visa. One last comment, actually, before we move on to this current slide. From what I've explained to you, this is the reason why TNs cannot be used for residency or fellowship. As you can see, of course, residents and fellows, their 100% reason for being, aside from maybe some research on the side, is actual clinical medical care. And so there's no way that the medical care or patient care can ever be termed as incidental. So that's why residency programs, fellowship programs, you may have heard about the TN, but it's not something that you would see or help a resident or a fellow apply for. So just very briefly, let's go over the pros and the cons of the TN. The TN pros, I mean, it's a much, much easier application process. Again, it's simply presenting a letter or a contract from the U.S. employer to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection folks at the border. Or if someone, let's say, is in Toronto, it would be presenting that to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection officer at the airport. Now, of course, you may be thinking to yourself, well, okay, that means if you're in Toronto, you're going to be flying to the U.S., and then you'll be presenting this documentation to a U.S. Customs and Border Protection officer here at Detroit Metro Airport. You know, actually, it's very interesting. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency actually maintains some external offices, including one at Pearson International Airport in Toronto. So the interesting part of all of this is that the inspection, the interview, the determination of whether someone flying from Toronto qualifies for a TN is actually done in Toronto at Pearson International Airport. This way, the person boards the airplane with the TN already approved, And of course, this smooths the way for them to simply get off the plane here in Detroit and then go to their destination. There are certain other airports that do the same, but other than that, most TNs are granted either at a U.S. border entry point along the border or at one of these what they call pre-flight inspections, such as Pearson. Now, Canadian citizens are the only ones in the world for TNs and all of their visas, and we'll go over this in a minute, who do not need to apply for a visa stamp or sticker for their passport at a U.S. consulate or embassy abroad. Because the U.S. and Canada are contiguous, and for whatever reason, the State Department felt like maybe it was just a waste of time and a waste of resources, and I'm sure that's what they were thinking. Canadians do not need to go through the step of making an appointment at a U.S. consulate or embassy for a TN or for just about any other visa, except for e-visas, which are treaty trader visas, which are really beyond the scope of today's presentation. So the nice thing is they can enter the U.S. same day, go to the border, same day, enter, start working. The U.S. job can be part-time or full-time, and there can even be multiple employers. There is no USCIS involvement, no petition. So in other words, with an H-1B, the first step is always to apply to the USCIS for an H-1B approval notice. With the TN is simply granted at the border or at pre-flight inspection. There's no filing of any petition with the USCIS. The other nice thing about the TN, for Canadians at least, is the cost is $56. It's $56 at the border. That covers the cost of the what they call the I-94 or entry document, and that's it, and that's per person. Now, in contrast to that, just very quickly, Mexican citizens actually do have to go to a U.S. consulate or embassy to obtain an ATN visa sticker or stamp for their passports before they're able to come to the U.S. and apply for admission as a TN. Now, some of the cons, only available for Canadian and Mexican citizens. Certain professions, such as treating physicians, that is, physicians whose primary purpose is providing medical care, TN is not permitted for that. You also have to find employment in the U.S. before applying. It's not like you can apply for a TN saying that, hey, I'm going to find a job in the U.S., so I'd like a TN and then I'll do my job search. You have to have the job already, and then you have to have certain documentation, like we said, from with a letter or contract, so that you can obtain your TN. One question I get just about once a month is whether someone can be self-employed in the U.S. as a TN. Can I set up my own company? The answer is you can't be self-employed. There are some other visas that, let's say you own a Canadian company and you want to set up a U.S. subsidiary. There are some visas that may work depending on the nature of your business, the amount of business, and other things. Those visas are generally known as the L1, sometimes also E1 or E2. But for purposes of the TN, self-employment is not permitted. And the last thing is it's what's known as a single intent visa. What that means is that when you obtain a TN, your sole intent or intention is supposed to be to work in the U.S. on a temporary basis. Now, of course, as I said a couple of minutes ago, some people have held TN status for something like 20 years. Yet the TN does assume that the person is coming here temporarily and at some point will leave the U.S. So what that means is not having the intent to have a green card or to obtain a green card, and not having the intent to remain in the U.S. on a permanent basis. Moving on, another question that we get here a lot is, again, because we're a border state and a border area, is what is the commuter green card and how does that differ from a regular green card, and what does it all mean? So let's talk about commuter green cards and regular green cards for a couple of minutes. As you know, just to start with, the green card is the permanent right to live and work in the United States. So it's not U.S. citizenship, but it is a permanent right to be here and to work. So the green card does not allow a person to get a U.S. passport, does not allow a person to vote in U.S. elections, and should the person commit certain criminal acts, it is possible for the Immigration Service to start proceedings to revoke the green card and perhaps have the person removed or deported back to the home country. In contrast to that, when a person does become a U.S. citizen, they can apply for a U.S. passport, they can vote in U.S. elections, and even if they unfortunately commit some type of criminal act, they cannot have their citizenship stripped and be removed or deported to a foreign country unless the citizenship was obtained by fraud. So Let's talk about commuter green cards. Sure, the regular green card allows a person to work and live in the US, but what about people who would prefer to live in a border area, such as Canada, and commute to a US job daily on a permanent basis? There is something called a commuter green card, and it really does allow that. It allows people to live in Canada or Mexico and to commute to a US job on a permanent basis. So while they have a green card, it also allows them to live in their home country and cross the border every day. And they can do this on a permanent basis. So there are really two types of commuter green cards. Number one, those who commute for regular employment, and then those who perform various types of seasonal employment in the US. Now, there is a limitation on this type of green card, and it's a very, very important one. And that is that commuter green card holders have to present a new letter of employment from any US employer to the US Customs and Border Protection Office at one of the border points every 6 months. In other words, even though this commuter green card is quote unquote permanent, honestly, it really isn't because of the 6-month letter requirement. So every 6 months, you have to present a letter at the border from the US employer. It can be the same one that sponsored your green card. It can be a different one. It really doesn't matter what the job is. It doesn't matter what the rate of pay is, but you need to present that letter every 6 months in order to maintain the green card. Now, in terms of those folks who have spouses and kids who are living in Canada, the commuter green card is not available to them because the basis of or purpose of the green card is to allow someone to come to the US for purposes of working on a permanent basis while still living in Canada. And for spouses and kids, since they don't have that purpose, the commuter green card is not available. Now, what about people who get the commuter green card and then decide that they'd like to move to the US at some point? Or on the flip side of that, what about people who obtain a regular green card, are living in the US, and then decide, I'd like to move back to Canada, but still keep my green card? It is possible to apply to the USCIS, the Immigration Service, to change from a commuter green card to a regular green card, or to do the opposite, to change from a regular green card to a commuter green card. But it does require the application process. Last thing on this slide that is important if you have a commuter green card is that time spent on the commuter green card or holding the commuter green card does not count towards the requirements for applying for US citizenship. Only holding a standard regular green card and living in the US, only then does the time apply or count towards the requirements to applying for US citizenship. Okay, so just to summarize very quickly, commuter green card pros: you can switch between the commuter and the standard green card, allows you to live in your home country while working permanently in the US, and the person does not have to apply for a TN or any other type of visa every 3 years or every year or what have you. And you can change employers. So with the commuter green card, it's not required that you file an application every time you want to change an employer. You simply change the employer, and then at your next 6-month deadline, you provide a letter to the border from that employer. So a lot of people like the commuter green card because they intend to remain in Canada or Mexico. And this way they don't have to apply for a TN renewal at the border every year. They simply present their commuter green card every day. They can do so permanently, and that's really all they need to do. On the cons, or the con side, time spent as a commuter does not count towards the US citizenship requirement. Spouse and children, as we said a minute ago, don't get commuter green cards. And lastly, failure to show a 6-month letter at the border will lead to the ultimately to the revocation of the green card. Let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about the J1 visa. And for those of you who are foreign physicians holding a J1, or for graduate medical education programs that deal with J1s all the time, here's some information that I hope will be helpful regarding Canadians and the J1 visa. So as you know, J1s are commonly used for residents and fellows who are all being sponsored by the ECFMG, or Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates, to do their graduate medical education here in the US. So residents and fellows who hold a J1 can live in the US, or they can live in Canada or Mexico and commute if the program allows them to do that. They are all automatically subject to what's known as the 2-year foreign residency requirement, or also known as Section 212E. Section 212E is simply the part of the statute that talks about this requirement. So the 2-year foreign residence requirement, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, in a nutshell, just means that a person who completes their training in the U.S., that's residency or residency and fellowship, has to go back to the home country or their country of last permanent residence for 2 years before being eligible to get a U.S. green card or to apply for an H-1B. Or instead of going back to their home country, they can try and apply for a J-1 waiver. That is a waiver of that 2-year requirement. Now, it's important, this phrase that we've underlined here, country of last permanent residence. That's critically important because looking at the DS 2019, it will list a person's country of birth, country of citizenship, and country of last permanent residence. And it's that country that people must go back to in order to fulfill the requirement. In other words, if Canada is listed as the last permanent residence country, the person will not fulfill the requirement by spending 2 years in Paris or 2 years in Buenos Aires, Argentina, or anywhere else in the world. Now, it's kind of an interesting, I'm not sure if that it's a glitch in the law, but the way the law was written many, many years ago, it's very interesting because for Canadian citizens who are living in a border area or want to live in a border area, such as Windsor, Ontario, there is a way to fulfill the J-1 requirement by what we call sleeping in Canada. And so that gets back to, here's the answer to one of the questions that I mentioned at the outset of this presentation. Can you fulfill the J-1 requirement by sleeping in Canada? And the answer is actually yes. For people who are subject to the J-1 2-year foreign residency requirement, if they move to Canada or move back to Canada and live there for 2 years, they can actually come to the U.S. on a daily basis and work as an H-1B worker, for instance, if let's say they've obtained a position here as a physician with an H-1B. But as long as they go back to Canada daily and literally sleep there, after 2 years, they have not only worked in the U.S. as an H-1B, perhaps taken steps towards a green card, but most importantly, they have fulfilled the 2-year residency requirement. Now, it would really seem disingenuous to say that, well, you're in the U.S. for 8 hours a day or more working, and then by leaving every day and going home and sleeping, having dinner, sleeping, doing it again the next day, you have fulfilled the requirement. I'm not sure that the drafters of the law actually took into consideration the proximity of places like Michigan to Canada. But the law is the law. It's been the same for many, many years. And so this is definitely a way to fulfill that requirement with one very important caveat. That caveat is that the burden of proof is on the J-1 person to prove that they lived in Canada for 2 years. They've got to collect the evidence and they have to be prepared to present it at the border when they try to, or when they seek to move to the U.S. So things such as apartment lease, home mortgage, and really the best evidence of all, which is, the electronic payment of the toll every day at the border is recorded. And so if they can pull up their records or save their records for the 2-year period, showing that, yes, they actually did go back and forth every single day. Now, as you can imagine, one question I get I wouldn't say very frequently, sometimes this time of the year is, what if I say I'm living in Canada, but I'm actually staying here and then I'll just go back to Canada for the weekend? And as you can imagine, that is a non-starter. Again, the burden of proof is on the person who held the J-1 to prove that they totally fulfilled the requirement. If the person cannot prove it to the satisfaction of the officers at the border, then the person is not going to be allowed to enter and live here as an H-1B or other worker. So it's really important that they follow the rules because not only are there the toll receipts and toll records of that, but of course, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency has a record of every single time someone enters the U.S. So they can simply look at their own records and determine whether the person is honestly telling the truth about the time that they spent in Canada and the time that they spent in the U.S. Now, one last thing to note about folks who hold a J-1, Canadians, that is, Canadian citizens, for purposes of a residency or residency and fellowship. Again, another glitch in the law, or again, when it was written, maybe something not intended or thought about, is the fact that Canadian citizens can actually get an H-1B visa and live in the U.S. without fulfilling the J-1 2-year home residency requirement. Now, you may be scratching your head and saying, well, wait a second, how is that possible? Didn't you just say that you need a J-1 waiver where you need to fulfill the requirement or in order to get an H-1B? So both answers are actually correct. To change status in the US, you do need a J1 waiver, or you need to fulfill the 2-year residency requirement. On the other hand, if you are okay with deferring the 2-year requirement, knowing that it's going to be hanging over your head for some period of time, it is possible for Canadian citizens to obtain an H-1B by having their US employer apply for an H-1B, and then taking that approval notice to the border and seeking entry into the US. So the good news is, for someone who is not ready to deal with the fulfilling or obtaining a waiver of the 2-year foreign residency requirement, this is kind of a temporary stopgap measure. But ultimately, this is something that they're going to have to deal with at some point, because it will prevent them from getting a green card in the future. So, and also an H-1B is only good for a maximum of 6 years. So at some point, they're going to have to deal with the requirement. Just a quick note on the ECFMG, GME programs, and of course, foreign residents are very familiar with the ECFMG certificate, but there is an exception. Physicians or doctors who graduate from foreign medical schools generally need to have the ECFMG certification from the ECFMG, along with USMLE Step 1, 2CK, and either 2CS or the OET. Now, an ECFMG certificate is not required for physicians who graduate from a US medical school, or from folks who graduate from one of the 17 Canadian medical schools that are accredited by the LCME, or the Liaison Committee on Foreign Medical Education. So while those folks, well, at least the people who graduated from Canadian med schools, do need the USMLE, they do not need the ECFMG certificates. Now, in terms of physicians who graduate from a US program, whether it's a USMD program or a USDO program, for purposes of getting an H-1B, they actually don't need any of the USMLE at all. Simply the fact that they graduated from their US medical school, plus are licensed by the state of Michigan or whatever state they're working in, whether it's New York or California, that's all that's required. So we've talked a lot about the border today, so let's talk more about crossing the border. As I mentioned a little while ago, Canadian citizens are the only foreign citizens who are allowed to enter the US without first obtaining a visa stamp from a US embassy or consulate abroad. Depending on the embassy and consulate, some are very efficient at issuing visas, others not so. Some have no problem, giving you an appointment right away. Others may tell you, well, our first available appointment is in September. So Canadians not having to go to the embassy, any embassy, is a huge bonus, because it helps guarantee that they can get to the US on time, that there will not be a delay while they wait for a US embassy or consulate to grant them an appointment, to do necessary background and security checks, and ultimately to issue them a visa stamp in their passport so that they can then travel to the US. So instead, Canadian citizens can simply take their DS 2019 if they're a J1, or they can take their I-797 H-1B approval notice if they're an H-1B, or any other type of approval notice, an L1 visa, go right to the border or go right to pre-flight inspection and be admitted to the US to start work immediately. Various embassies and consulates around the world have different levels of security checks that they want to do, and not having to go to one of those offices is huge. Always be aware, and this is the most important thing, not only for Canadian citizens, but for everybody who seeks to enter the US for any reason, whether it's as a J1, H-1B, or just coming to visit and maybe go shopping or see relatives here before going back to Canada later in the day. That the officers at the border, and again, these are the US Customs and Border Protection officers, can and will, in certain situations, search your car, search your suitcase, bags, phones, computers. They may even ask you to empty your pockets, and they have the right to do that. And to answer one of the questions I asked at the outset, yes, they can actually arrest or detain your phone or computer or other electronics. And not only that, they can actually copy files that are on those devices. So it's important to note that whenever someone presents themselves at the border, it's known as being inspected. So while it is an interview, or at least interview is part of the process, it is an inspection. And as the word inspection commonly means, that means they can look at everything and anything. And So not really a warning, but just to be cognizant of what's in your car and what your passengers are bringing in the car. Because again, they can look at everything. People talk about the right to search and seizure and all these rights, but at the border, since you have not been formally and officially admitted to the U.S., the normal rights that people have against unreasonable searches and seizures or needing a search warrant for things just don't apply. The folks at the border are their job, among other things, is to make sure everyone who's applying for admission should and can be lawfully admitted, and also to make sure that people are not bringing contraband, weapons, or any other bad stuff across the border. So in terms of your cell phone, your computer, etc., definitely a good idea to have a backup of your files and things. I mean, it's not as if they will detain your computer every time. And in fact, most people, of course, pass through the border without a problem. But it's just good to know. And as the slide indicates, the U.S. Supreme Court has never addressed the issue of whether these searches of electronics, these detaining of electronics, are legal at the border. So at least at this point, they are legal. They continue. And so again, it's important to be cognizant of what you have in your car, what you have on your person. Just as an aside, many years ago, I met a client at the border, and we went in to talk to the officer, and the officer said, "Hi, nice to see you. Please empty your pockets." And the client thought that the officer was joking. He was laughing, and I'm like, actually, this is not a joke. You need to empty your pockets. So thankfully, there was nothing terrible in his pockets, but the officer did look through the wallet, pockets, things, not looking necessarily for anything terrible, but in that case, it was a situation of someone coming as a business visitor. And I think the officer wanted to make sure that the person was really coming to attend meetings. It was not coming here to work, which would not have been allowed under that temporary visitor visa. So again, be very careful. And also, it's important that people, of course, never misrepresent themselves and their intent at the border. Always be honest when being inspected, because any type of misrepresentation can lead to terrible consequences. So no matter what, of course, always tell the truth at the border. I mean, it really goes without saying, but sometimes I get questions like, should I tell the officer this or that? And the answer is really twofold. Number one, listen to the question the officer is asking, because many times it's simply a yes or no question. It's not one that requires a long, lengthy explanation about what the person intends to do a year from now or 5 years from now, or what they intend to do whenever. It's more like, okay, what are you doing today? What's your intent today? And that's it. So it's really important to listen to the question. If it only requires a yes or no answer, just give a yes or no. If the officer wants an explanation, they'll ask for an explanation. But very frequently, people get a little nervous at the border. They start answering all kinds of questions and saying things that were not asked. And when someone says something that was not asked about, but now it's out there because the person said it, the officer, of course, is compelled to follow up on that and ask some additional questions just to make sure that the person is eligible to enter the U.S. So word to the wise, just to answer the questions that are asked, and many questions are just very simple, and not to make a big deal out of certain questions that are just very simple and don't require anything, a lot of detail. So let's talk briefly about the NEXUS program. Some of you may have NEXUS cards, and that is an expedited way to cross the border from the U.S. to Canada, or back from Canada to the U.S. It's specifically for that crossing between U.S. and Canada, Canada to the U.S. It's run by the Canadian Border Agency and allows you to obtain a card that will expedite your travel across the border. These cards are valid for 5 years, then you can renew it. The cost is $50. There is a process or Mexico has its own trusted traveler program as well. Children under 18 don't have to pay the fee, but it's really important to know that if you break the rules, the card will be canceled. So a word to the wise, because people have called me maybe once every 5 years or so saying, I had my NEXUS card revoked at the border. What can I do? Or my spouse had that person's NEXUS card revoked. So a couple stories to help illustrate what not to do, I guess. Number one, years ago, there was someone who had a NEXUS card and was interviewed by an officer at the border who said, what are you bringing over today? The person said nothing. The officer said, actually going to do a random check. I'll pop your trunk. The officer found all kinds of stuff in there, nothing bad, but definitely more than was needed by a single person. The officer on the spot started the process to revoke the NEXUS card. And despite the person's protestations that, I didn't know that that was in there. I mean, my spouse uses the car and I had no idea. The NEXUS card was revoked because it's really that serious. They take this very seriously because they're allowing you expedited travel between two countries. And when you say you have nothing, they really mean nothing. And if they find something, that's it. The other thing is that not many years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, some people were crossing the border from Canada back into the US after having dinner in Windsor. At the border, they, as always, presented evidence of US citizenship. A couple of people presented their US passport. Someone presented an enhanced driver's license, and then someone else just went in the wallet and grabbed the NEXUS card. So the driver handed all this stuff over to the US Customs and Border Protection officer, and that's when the fireworks started. Why? Because sure, it's fine to present the US passports, no problem presenting the enhanced driver's license. Well, based on all that, you're saying to yourself, well, what's left? There's just the NEXUS card. But of course, that allows a person to cross the border. So why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem, big problem, because the NEXUS rules say that if you're going to present a NEXUS card at the border, going either way, everybody else in the car must also present a NEXUS card. Now, if not everybody has a NEXUS card, then nobody can present a NEXUS card. So what happened is, by presenting this NEXUS card, the person violated the rules. Now, while it's true that the US Customs and Border Protection officer could have just given them a slap on the wrist and said, look, maybe you didn't know the rule, or maybe you forgot the rule, but I'm going to tell you one more time, give you one final reminder that you cannot show your NEXUS card when everybody else in the car is using something other than a NEXUS card. Instead, the officer immediately started the procedure to revoke the NEXUS card. This caused these folks to wait at the border for about 2 hours while this was all going through. And in addition, the officers used it as an excuse to search their car, which the officers may not have done otherwise. So word to the wise, definitely if you're going to use NEXUS or any of the other trusted traveler programs such as Global Entry, it's important to know the rules and to abide by them 100%, because the consequences of not following them is that you will get your card revoked. Next, well, this is actually the end of this session, and thank you very much for joining us. Next time, we're going to be talking about employment-based green cards, and there are many different types of employment-based green cards. So I look forward to talking to you at that time, and we'll go over various different green card procedures, what's required, and we may actually touch on a couple types of green cards that, while an employer may be involved in some capacity, it's not a green card that's actually sponsored by an employer. So we hope that you'll join us at that time. And as always, if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to us. And here's our contact information. There's the email address or telephone, and also our website as well. I'm always happy to hear from everybody, and it's really a pleasure to not only to be with you today and then each month at this on this day and time, but also to answer your questions if you have them. And again, we look forward to hearing from you, and we would be happy to assist you with any visa or immigration matters that you may have. So if there are any questions now, I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, thank you again all very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to be with you. And for those of you who are in places where spring has arrived, like here in Detroit, I hope you enjoy the beautiful weather. And for people who are in places like California and Florida, where it's usually nice, we're finally enjoying some of the same weather. So the snow is gone, the freezing cold weather is gone, and I hope that you all, no matter where you are, have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you very much, and hope to see you next month.